Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last of the CriSHET seminars this week. Yeah, it's unfortunate, isn't it? But ending off very appropriately, I think, with Professor Shirley Anne Tate, who's going to be talking about whiteliness and institutional racism hiding behind unconscious bias. Professor Tate is a professor of race and education at Leeds Beckett University, which is the first appointment of its kind in the UK. As a cultural sociologist, she's a qualitative researcher interested in intersectional thinking. In her writing, research, and teaching, she draws on Black feminist, gender, critical race, queer, post-colonial, Caribbean, decolonial theory within her overall focus on Black Atlantic diaspora studies and emerging identifications. Shirley's research interests include the body, mixed race, domestic and care work, mixed race, beauty, Black intersectional identifications, migration, positive and negative affect, the culture of Britishness, food, race and performativity, decoloniality, transracial intimacies, skin bleaching and lighting, toning, and the politics of skin. She has for some time been developing an area of work on racism's affect within the micro-practices of institutional racism, which has an academic and practitioner or activist audience in South Africa, the US, the USA, Brazil, and the UK. Her 2015 book on decolonizing skin bleaching in Black Atlantic zones has a wide academic interest within the UK and within South Africa. Some of her titles, I won't go through all of them because we'll be here for a while, include The Governmentality of Black Beauty and Shame, Discourse, Iconicity, and Resistance, published in 2017, Black Skins, Black Masks, Hybridity, Dialogism, and Performativity in 2016, Black Women's Bodies and the Nation, Race, Gender, and Culture, published in 2015. She focuses on conversations on Black British women as a lens to examine the impact of discourses surrounding Black beauty and shame. Please help me welcome Professor Shirley Anne Tate. Thank you. That's perfect. Let's. I think this is it.
Thank you, Mo, for such a wonderful introduction. It's kind of hard for me to follow Michaelinas from yesterday, but I'm going to try my best. I've tried to cut down what is a longish paper. Hopefully it'll fit in the hour. I've done some PowerPoints as well, which will be available for you. And this paper has been published, so you can actually read it online in the journal it was published in. I wrote this paper with my colleague, the dean of the school, Damien Page, because we kept sitting in meetings and kept hearing this phrase, unconscious bias. So this paper actually emerges from somewhere. It's not just because I just thought, oh, let me just do something on unconscious bias. It emerges for me from discontent with unconscious bias being used as an alibi to explain institutional racism away, to explain the fact that we have an enormous Black student attainment gap in UK universities, but it's caused by unconscious bias, to also explain away the fact that we have continuing disparities in terms of recruitment of Black faculty and faculty of color in the UK as opposed to white faculty, and that's caused by unconscious bias, to just explain away institutional racism as a whole. So I got fed up with it. I got tired of the use of unconscious bias to cover up, to forgive, to continue this kind of erasure of really very egregious and continuing institutional racism. in my institution, but also clearly others. So I'll rehearse the abstract a bit so that you'll remember what I'm supposed to be talking about in case I don't get to talk about it, so you'll know what I had intended, all right? And then I'll just say very briefly what the argument is going to be in case I don't get to the end, because that does happen as well. But as I said, you can kind of read it as well. Now let me see if I can do it. Ah, it worked. Okay. So the thing I'm talking about, unconscious bias, you can see there it doesn't have the bracket around the UN, and that's for a reason. I made that distinction to talk about this unconscious bias as the one that's been institutionalized. And then later on, I put the one with the bracket around it to talk about how we need to see unconscious bias as very conscious. Anyway, so unconscious bias is seen as something that happens by our brains making incredibly quick judgments and assessments of people and situations without us realizing. Our biases are influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. We may not even be aware of these views and opinions or be aware of their full impact and implications. So says the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK. The Equality Challenge Unit has been funded or is being funded by all universities in the UK, by the Higher Education Funding Council in Wales, and also by the Higher Education Funding Council in Scotland. It's kind of the university funding its own watchdog that looks at its diversity and inclusion policies and gives them advice. And one of the pieces of advice that they have been giving them for a very long time is that the problem is unconscious bias, and if we can deal with unconscious bias, then everything will be all right. And one of the ways forward, they think, is we should send people on unconscious bias training. Anyway, so I really speak against this particular point of view, which sees it as unconscious, right? Because for me, bias is very conscious. And bias is linked to Charles Mills's racial contract and his epistemologies of ignorance. These epistemologies of ignorance emerge from our background, our cultural environment, and our personal experience, that's for sure. So we can't keep saying that unconscious bias stems from just that, because what that does then is it makes us not think about white supremacy at all, and it also maintains white innocence and white fragility, and it makes us forget institutional racism, so it creates this culture of a will to forget institutional racism, in fact. And inequality and diversity training, unconscious bias has become something of what Sarah Ahmed would call a performative act. It proclaims you to be innocent because you've confessed to the sin of the bias, the unconscious bias that you had. So what I want to do is to move beyond this version of unconscious bias, which says that we can be trained out of our unconscious bias, and then we can construct this post-race university, to think instead about what would happen if we decolonize unconscious bias, if we decolonize white fragility, if we also decolonize the self-forgiveness that goes with all of that, so that we can then begin to see the hidden basis of institutional whiteliness within unconscious bias itself. So that's what the paper does. And the argument of the paper is basically around looking at unconscious bias from its social psychological roots. And this is what is expressed in equality, diversity, and inclusion training in the UK. It's all this social psychology stuff. It also says, my argument, that unconscious bias is about diminishing the recognition of white supremacy, but really specifically in order to maintain white supremacy within institutions as kind of the organizing focus of UK universities. What happens through unconscious bias, of course, is that there is a silencing that is also instantiated. And this silencing is very political. It is not some neutral silencing. You know, it's very ideological because it also enables a white will to forget anti-black racism and anti-people of color racism as well. So for me, what we must focus on is the question of who gains from clinging to the idea of unconscious bias as something that really can't be helped. It's unconscious after all. Let me see where I've got to. Right, so I'm going to then, at the end, as I said before, decolonize the idea of white fragility, because people talk about that a lot. You know, when you're doing unconscious bias training, you have to think about the person in the room. You can't blame the person. You know, you can't hurt that fragile psyche. We must not blame anyone for something that they could not help. And we must forgive, and we must forgive ourselves as well, because that's what unconscious bias training actually does. It installs white fragility and self-forgiveness as the institutional approach to anti-racist practice until we all know better, because we've been trained in unconscious bias, trained to recognize it within ourselves. All right. So, a bit now to look at a little bit of the social psychology aspect of unconscious bias, because there's a massive literature. Unconscious bias has ceased to be just a phrase, a gesture towards so-called unwitting racism, and a call to anti-racist forgiveness of individual and institutional racism. Unconscious bias has become ever more prevalent within institutions, absorbed into corporate training as essential to an organization's equality and diversity mission and institutional anti-racist transformation at the levels of culture, process, and systems. With roots in social psychology, unconscious bias has become the magic cure for organizations, including universities, in the face of the continued occurrence of racism. Despite protestations of egalitarianism and meritocracy, UK universities remain largely white institutions, which have sought a means of addressing whiteliness that avoids an acknowledgement of structural and systemic racism. So unconscious bias has emerged within the equality, diversity, and inclusion environment in UK higher education institutions as an explanation for statistical racial disparities. Disparities, as I said before, in terms of student attainment, but also in terms of the employment of staff. So for me, what we have in the UK at the moment is unconscious bias being used as the acceptable face of racism, the phrase that a majority white sector feels comfortable with using and discussing to describe itself. And I've sat in many meetings where, for example, the chief executive officer of a funding body in the sciences said, yes, we had to think about how we were going to begin to get more BAME. We're called BAME in the UK, Black and Minority Ethnic applicants, you know, and more Black and Minority Ethnic PhD students to apply for funding. So we decided what we should do is all of us should be trained in unconscious bias. So we all did it, and now it's great. Didn't improve the numbers, of course, didn't change anything. And the point about unconscious bias training is also how it's done. Any new entrant to a university will be asked to do unconscious bias training as part of the Equality and Diversity Action Plan of the university. So this course is a 10-minute online training course with a multiple choice assessment that you do because you have to do it to show that you embrace the university mission of equality, diversity, and inclusion. Unconscious bias training demonstrates, they think, universities' good faith and willingness to address racism and offers a retake of the online test if you fail the first time. So no one is left behind or outside the unconscious bias community because it is regarded as the principal vehicle for institutional anti-racist cultural change. Participants pass the training course if they learn the language, acceptable behaviors, and moral psychology of unconscious bias. If they learn to be able to recognize when it is appropriate to assert that an event is the result of unconscious bias. Such events can range from strategic direction to recruitment and selection, promotion processes, to what's in the curriculum, admission, student experience, and outcomes. So unconscious bias is seen to pervade all aspects of institutional life. Jennifer Saul's work actually is very similar to the definition that I started with from the ECU. She has worked for some time on implicit bias and stereotype threat and their impact on women in philosophy. And for her, unconscious bias is like implicit bias. And these affect the way we perceive, the way we evaluate or interact with people from the groups that our biases target. She also says that even those who explicitly and sincerely avow egalitarian views hold implicit biases against such groups as blacks, women, gay people, etc. And this is even true of the targeted group, she said. So, for example, women can be biased against women. The ECU has developed training material, keeping this particular version of unconscious bias in mind to help us to uncover unconscious bias and act to counter it. But if you think about it, if these unconscious biases are so deeply ingrained into our thinking and emotions, they will be very resistant to change. Notwithstanding this, this unconscious bias has initiated a resurgence in diversity training within a background of continuing racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, transphobia, class discrimination, and rampant cisgender politics within UK universities. So my concern here, as with everywhere else, is to think about the very micro practices of the continued workings of anti-Black and people of color racism and white supremacy within unconscious bias itself. So we have to see, really, I think, unconscious bias not as some kind of ramblings of some misled social psychologist, you know. We have to see it as an aspect of the institution. We have to view it as one aspect of the institutionalization of what Charles Mills calls racial liberalism. So I hope that what I will show is that unconscious bias, or that I show in the paper, because you'll have to read it afterwards, I'm sure. I will show that unconscious bias is a technology of racialized governmentality which always keeps the status quo of whiteliness in place within post-race universities and their libidinal economies. And I'll say what some of that stuff is later. So unconscious bias is really pernicious because whiteliness continues to be enabled within universities, which also claim to be post-racial, liberal, tolerant spaces. So I want to go on to the next bit. I've just given you a brief kind of social psychological. I hope it made some sense. The next bit I want to do is to say a small amount about unconscious bias in equality, diversity, and inclusion training. So it won't be very long, this part. What I want to do in this part is for us to pause a little bit and think about the UN, the UN in unconscious bias. I did this as like an exercise to myself. I like to sometimes play word games because it really helps me to look at each part of the word and what does each part mean and what does it mean when it's shoved together. So I did this. I paused and I thought about un, which is the prefix in unconscious. Un is significant, it turned out, in my musings, in my study. It's significant because this is where the denial of anti-Black and people of color racism is maintained. Un denotes an absence of a quality or state, a reverse of, a lack of, and gives a negative force to conscious bias. It denies the possibility of racist bias and erases the possibility of racism. In contradistinction to this, we can also have another inscription of unconscious bias, which becomes bracket UN and then conscious. because that means that we acknowledge that it is conscious, even though we might think it's unconscious, right? So bracketed UN and then conscious. So that reverses the UN as an alibi for continuing white supremacy, according to my formulation. What's interesting, of course, is that unconscious bias is seen as completely inevitable and completely normalized at the societal level and within institutions. The expectation is it is there, it will happen. And racism, interestingly, is not seen as something that is there and will happen. You know, racism is rarely used in the unconscious bias field. To me, that's really revealing. Because what we see is that unconscious bias, without the bracket, is a very active choice to erase racism and its actions. But if you're somebody who really follows the logic of unconscious bias, you would say that racism comes from unconscious bias and it's not a really active choice, you know. Nobody chooses to be racist, it just kind of happens. We don't have any power over this. It just comes out of our mouth because it's in our psyche already. So racism within universities has become something that's very aversive. People don't like you to use that word. They want you to say unconscious bias is what done it, to use colloquial English. Unconscious bias is what done it. You can't say this is about racism, right? So in aversively racist organizations like universities, which are built on the foundations of equality, overt forms of racism are often said to have been eliminated, except, of course, as a body that experiences racism, as a psyche that experiences racism, I have to say, is not been eliminated at all, and of course we know this. So overt forms of racism are said to have been eliminated, and what instead we get to talk about, because it's polite, you know, if you're in a meeting with the VC, you can't say, but Peter, it's racism. You can't say that. You've got to say it's unconscious bias, because that's totally palatable, you know what I mean? Yes, so I don't do it personally, but that's the expectation. Oh, yes. Did I do this right? Which one am I on now? Is that 7 or so? Wait, let me just go back a bit. Oh yeah, that's okay. So the next bit is unconscious bias without the bracket and maintaining whiteliness through ignorance. Okay. So I want to start here with George Yancey's work, and if you've never read his work, I really think you should read it. He does great work on, you know, whiteness. George Yancey describes whiteliness, which is one of the words in my title, as a social, psychological, and phenomenological. Oh, I said it first time. I sometimes get that really wrong. That was good. I won't try it again, though. I'll just leave that there. Racial reality for white people. And this racial reality for white people, that is people racialized as white, is constructed by an intersubjective matrix, whereby people racialized as white enact a common being raced in the world, which is seen as really utterly benign, because it's really natural, it's normal, but which is nefariously oppressive, according to George Yancey. So we cannot only label acts committed by openly self-ascribed racists as racist, because racism is not just about believing in the existence of biological races, according to Yancey. Getting people racialized as white to let go of such a false ontology, you know, that there are biological races, has not been shown to bring the end to anti-black and people of color racism. The coloniality of white power keeps being recentered because there's no interrogation of whiteliness, of its political, economic, social, imaginative, epistemic, and affective boundaries. This is even the case in contexts in which we are asked to look at our unconscious biases. The problem is that such asking does not commit us to delegitimizing those white normative practices, systems of thought and effective regimes that maintain and recycle anti-black and people of color racism. Part of what keeps whiteliness in place as legitimate is the epistemologies of ignorance of racism that Charles Mills talks about in his work. Ooh, that was a comment, I think. So Charles Mills talks about epistemologies of racism, where racism and white supremacy do not exist, or in a spectacular denial of white supremacy, if racism exists, then black people can be racist too. Drawing from Charles Mills, Sullivan and Tuana also talk about epistemologies of ignorance and how important it is, what the task must then be for us as intellectuals working in this area of tracing what is not known, and the politics of such ignorance must be a key element of epistemological, social, and political analyses to reveal the operations of power. So we have a lot of work to do, you know, as people interested in the kind of continuation of racism within higher education institutions. And it's not just a lot, but it's continuous as well, because of course we know the minute you spot it, it kind of morphs into something else, right? So you have this constant task of what Andre talked about, of getting your shovel out and excavating a bit all the time. Right. So unconscious bias is linked to power. And unconscious bias, of course, if you think about it, yes, is linked to the processes of the production of white supremacy. And what's interesting, according to Robin DiAngelo in the 2011 work on white fragility, is that you get white supremacy, but at the same time you get this emergence of white fragility, you know, this kind of discourse of white fragility. We're all really nice. Why are you treating us so badly? It's not fair. We're all trying to do the best we can, but you won't accept that. So for Robin DiAngelo, talking about, of course, the American situation, because that's where this person is based, people racialized as white in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress, unlike black people and people of color. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what I refer to as white fragility. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. I find that really interesting because, you know, I don't know, those of you who teach sometimes, you know, in the UK I've been teaching about racism, and what I get from some white students is this incredible withdrawal and this building of a wall around. You can't get through it. That's absolute withdrawal and distancing. So it's about white fragility. Now I understand it. Now I've read Robin DiAngelo's work. Because it's not about not liking you as a person. It's not liking the topic. It's not liking having to look at oneself as perhaps perpetuating, you know, white supremacy. Okay. So the institutionalization of unconscious bias as alibi for white supremacy is part of white fragility, and thereby unconscious bias reinstates white racial equilibrium. So of course there's going to be an inevitability of the spread of unconscious bias and its continual use within institutions, because it provides kind of like a palatability to discussions of racial discrimination within organizations. And through this, it continues to facilitate what Charles Mills talks about, the epistemologies of ignorance. You never talk about racism, you talk about it in euphemisms like unconscious bias or unwitting this or whatever. So in the UK at the moment, what we have is a long-standing tradition. And this long-standing tradition is one in which you don't get discussions of anti-black and people of color racism. Very rarely are they held in majority white institutions, as claiming to be unaware of racism would be exposed as not being about a lack of knowledge after all, not being about a lack of information either, but rather as willfully ignoring the racism within the ivory tower. So we have, for example, discussions about the underattainment of black students and students of color, where lo and behold, it's not about looking at the institution and what the institution does and what the institution is. It's all about the problem of the black student and the student of color. And some of the things I've heard are absolute doozies, right? For example, these students have different cultural learning styles. And my question about, I mean, I can see that I might have a different cultural learning style because I'm not English and I was educated in Jamaica for most of my life. So yeah, I can get that. But these are people who were born and brought up in the UK, went to school in the UK, are only UK black people, but they have different cultural learning styles. And the people in the room could not see that that was kind of odd as a statement to make. So that's one. And the other one is the students who commute. The commute is too tough. They can't learn. Interesting too, I was a commuting student. I got a first. What does that mean? You know what I mean? So people can always come up with reasons for why things don't happen because of the problem with the racialized other. So unconscious bias keeps being there, part of our institutional life, and it keeps enabling what Sarah Ahmed would call a declaration of whiteness, in which admissions of bad practice or admissions of being bad, I said something but I didn't really mean it, and then, you know, Shirley was offended and I didn't mean to offend Shirley, right? Where admissions of bad practice become sign of good practice. So you confess. I confess my sin today, Pastor Shirley or Pastor whatever, and you know, you're forgiven because you've done the confession. So that means something. That means you're changing and the institution is changing as well. But that's not quite so. If we look at what Frank Wilderson sets out as the operation of the libidinal economy of racism within institutions, for him, libidinal economy is related to affiliation, so to liking somebody or something, but also phobia, fear and hatred. So that's how racism kind of works. That's how also unconscious bias works, I would expect. So he says, the libidinal economy of racism is as objective as political economy. It has effects, you know, it affects things as well. So libidinal economy for him structures psychic and emotional life, and it's very resistant to change. It is, of course, if you see unconscious bias as operating within a libidinal economy of racism within institutions, you can see how people will be very attached to it. Because if you're attached to it, that means you can never be blamed for anything to do with racism. It's not your fault. So people have, you know, anxieties as well about their attachment to unconscious bias, especially when they're challenged a bit about it. But they also get great pleasure from saying, but I didn't do it really. It's the society that did it to me. And, you know, I can't change the society that we live in because it's always been that way. And I wouldn't know where to start. You've got to help me, Shirley, help me, you know, things like that. So we can see this tenacious but mobile fixation of anti-black and people of color racism if we continue to look at the underrepresentation of black people and people of color in UK universities in terms of members of faculty, in terms of also members of the professoriate. In the UK, up to this moment, there has not been one black vice-chancellor of any university in the UK, even though, you know, there have been black academics for many years. We've got Dame Valerie Amos, but she's not the VC of the School of Oriental and African Studies, somebody once reminded me, she's the director. She's the highest ranked black person in a university in the UK. So we have a position, of course, a continuing position in which we have the erasure of black bodies, black knowledge, black methodologies, black ways of seeing the world. There is this erasure so that white power and privilege can continue to be maintained. And people here talk about the same thing as well, I know that. Erasure occurs through a peculiar kind of social recognition that continues to distort reality. So white people, George Yancey would say, continue to mis-see themselves. They don't see themselves properly, they mis-see themselves. And they mis-see themselves as civilized superiors still, even though, you know, the empire has long gone. They still continue to mis-see themselves as civilized superiors, and they continue to see black people and people of color as inferior others. He actually said inferior savages, but I didn't want to use that word, but, you know, it's come out now. It's been outed from my paper, yeah. And whilst this kind of construction of the self and the other is going on, there's also a collective amnesia about the past of empire, colonialism, and enslavement. And that just continues. Even though, you know, in Liverpool, we do have a fantastic slavery museum. So if you ever visit, you should go see that. That's our acknowledgement of enslavement in the UK. So, such mis-seeing and peculiar social recognition implicates unconscious bias as part of the maintenance of such power, especially if we think through the lens afforded us by the racial contract and its epistemologies of ignorance, you know, Mills's work. Mills's racial contract inserts an analysis of the operation of white supremacy within the social contract invented by Western political philosophers. The contract and its epistemologies enable white supremacy and its racial entitlements to remain unseen by those racialized as white, but it also remains unseen by those black people who buy into the racial contract for their own benefit as well. Mills's racial contract extends from culture to politics to economy to moral psychology, which he sees as being skewed consciously and unconsciously towards white supremacy and a differential racial entitlement towards white privilege, in fact. And this white privilege is simply taken as a given, is taken as a completely normative thing. That's how it's always been, and that's how it will continue. So we see this norm of whiteliness within institutions expressed through things like institutional culture, practices like recruitment and selection, where people still say, oh, she'd fit great into the team. I'm not sure about that other one, though. That Shirley Tate might be a bit problematic. But she'd fit great into the team, right? We see that a lot. Where fitting great into the team is, is kind of like saying, yeah, she's a nice white person, she'd be great. Yeah. And we have curriculum construction, which, like here, still continues to be very Eurocentric. And as Andre talked about in his inaugural, if there is any kind of inclusion, it's kind of like an adding in, you know, like a tacking on of, like, oh, let's just put Paul Gilroy in there, and that's it. You've covered all the black theory, all the black-generated theory ever, just in that 1 week with one thing that Paul Gilroy wrote, for example. Right. So we still have unconscious bias maintaining the privilege of those racialized as white and non-whites who support whiteliness. And black and people of color phobia lives on within the libidinal economies of white institutions, organized by trajectories of repulsion rather than attraction, by phobic strivings away from rather than philic, rather than loving strivings towards. Unconscious bias is part of the apparatus of maintaining white racialized power by calling on the idea of ignorance, of not knowing that what is being done or said is racist, because it was not willfully said or done to hurt, to discriminate, to be racist. As I said before, it came from somewhere over which we have no control, that is the unconscious. So let's move on a bit to this part. So, as I said before, if you make a claim that some racism has occurred or that somebody said something which was racist, you get white fragility kicking in then, and people want to talk about I didn't mean it, please forgive me, or I have to forgive myself because I didn't really mean it. So white fragility and self-forgiveness emerge as key discourses focused on minimizing risk to the benefits that emerge from white privilege while keeping institutional racism in place. So I want to just go on and just look a little bit at what decolonizing white fragility and self-forgiveness as an approach to institutional racism might mean. So I want to change tack a little bit and look at the word bias, again, to think about what does it mean and what can it tell us. So I checked it in the dictionary. I still have my beaten up Oxford dictionary from high school. It's really old, kind of stuck together with sellotape, but I love it. So bias, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is a direction diagonal to the weave of the fabric. So that's the kind of bias that I want to use now, a direction diagonal to the weave of the fabric. If we take this diagonal approach to thinking, which we will try to establish as we look at white fragility, we can see its link to unconscious bias and its attached self-forgiveness as an antidote to any claims at all of institutional racism. In equality, diversity, and inclusion understandings, as I said before, we have to confess to unconscious bias to move towards diminishing institutional racism. This confession instantiates, if we quote Sarah Ahmed here, a fantasy of transcendence in which what is transcended is the very thing admitted to in the declaration. So if we say, oh, that could have been something racist that I said, that very saying means you kind of purge yourself of, the possibility of the racist act, right? Confessions of unconscious bias can recenter white supremacy by removing blame and its accompanying shame and guilt, which is part of the process of unlearning white supremacy. White fragility emerges as vulnerability, anger, fear, for which the only balm is self-forgiveness, because you simply did not actively know your racism was unconscious. After all, unconscious bias begins from the premise of inevitability and normalization. If you think unconscious bias is normal because that's where society is, then it's always inevitable and totally normalized. However, self-forgiveness is inactive as an approach to institutional racism because it relies on introspection on the part of the white self and institution, which is what Yancey calls a distancing strategy. Unconscious bias is a strategy to distance the white self from the charge of racism, and indeed that one can be implicated in its perpetuation. Unconscious bias does this by occluding the extent of white supremacy and its impact on black people and people of color, and on white people themselves, by focusing on the white suffering that results from irrational claims of anti-black and people of color racism. If you make claims about racism, it's always, kind of irrational, because no, it didn't really happen, no, it's just in your imagination, that kind of thing. So unconscious bias maintains white supremacy, as I've said before. How many times have I said that? You've got that part now, haven't you, I guess? Yeah. It maintains white supremacy, and indeed, its very definition insists that racist culture and environment are crucial to its existence. The need to focus on white suffering, white fragility, to say it is not your fault, produces a paradox at its center, where those racialized as white are victims of the racism from which they benefit. The culture of the organization is a zone of suturing, according to George Yancey. It's about suturing of whiteliness to white power and privilege, which is not undone through confessions of unconscious bias. This is so because white supremacy remains stubbornly in place as it is not challenged by the beneficiaries of the racial contract, which, as we recall from Mills above, can also include non-whites. Through an engagement with literature and training in unconscious bias, white institutions simply feel that they need do nothing at all apart from to confess to having unconscious bias. So here we have the racial contract in action, where white power and white supremacy as the norm do not need to be investigated any further, because whiteliness is not the problem. Racism is. Everybody can be racist, including black people, and we're not white supremacists or have right-wing politics, so we can't possibly be racist. Because, you know, the only racists in the UK really are the alt-right or the Nazis or something like that. Does this distancing strategy meant to avert the gaze from whiteliness sound familiar, is my question. The charge of black racism does not take into account, of course, the systemic nature of racism, empire, colonialism, nor the white constructed racializing assemblages, to quote Alexander Weheliye, that ensure white supremacy continues. To assert that only self-proclaimed white supremacists are racist is to continue not to see one's part in maintaining whiteliness, which remains an active non-knowing. All right, let me, maybe, is there another one, slide 15? Did I go past slide 15? Oh, let's start with slide 15. All right, I think that was the last one. But the problem, of course, is that unconscious bias cannot fix institutional racism because racist white relationalities extend from and to the white self through the process of white subject formation that restrict access to understanding the extent of white racism through ignorance or through claims to ignorance. So when I say, for example, I experience racism simply by walking into a room and people turning and looking at me, if I say that to white colleagues who haven't thought about how white racism works, anti-black racism works, they would say to me, but Shirley, you are being just sensitive. People looked at you because you're so beautiful, you're stunning, eye-catching, or some such stupidity. Anyway. So what we have to do, what do we have to do to disrupt whiteliness within institutions, to get beyond unconscious bias to thinking about how we can dismantle the toxic culture of institutional racism in UK universities? So we have to bring about normative white disruption. We have to engage in the other meaning of bias. We have to think diagonally. We have to think against the grain, in other words. We have to think against the grain to rupture white fragility and the culture of thinking it's unconscious bias that did it. This bias, this diagonal thinking, is about, if we paraphrase Yancey again, that we choose to lose our way. We practice becoming unsuited to whiteliness, and we seek to not see it as the normative expectation, so we have to lose our way. And this losing our way produces a space of criticality. It produces the diagonal thinking of the bias, so that we can come to terms with the fact of whiteliness and our complicity with and involvement in maintaining a white racist social skin, which extends from the individual to the social and back again in a feedback loop. We have to look at ourselves as black people, interested in anti-racist politics, and think about what we ourselves do to maintain white supremacy in its place. We have to dismantle this white racist social skin. We have to dismantle the white epistemologies of ignorance which abound around anti-black and people of color racism, which are so entrenched. We have to think diagonally. We have to decenter whiteliness and never return it as the center, never return it as fragile, never return it as vulnerable, but acknowledge it as supremacist, acknowledge it as a site of the coloniality of power, as Encarnacion Gutierrez also has said in her work, and also acknowledge it as a location which is inimical to everyone's psychic health. Fanon taught us this lesson many decades ago. Racism is not good for anybody. It's not good for white people, it's not good for black people. It's in our mutual interest to unseat it. It is only through a refusal of this return that bias, thinking diagonally, can enable a form of thinking which dwells on the question of the uneasy feelings, the uneasy practices and uneasy processes caused by white racism's institutionally and personally felt impacts, rather than eliding this unease that we feel within the space of the university through focusing on unconscious bias. We have to dwell on uneasy feelings, dwell on uneasy practices, and dwell on uneasy processes. Because it's only this that will enable us to challenge and address racism within UK spaces which still maintain that they are post-race. You know, race no longer matters, we're all equal, we can all achieve the same. That kind of narrative is what we have in the UK. So we have to dwell with unease within post-race contexts where racism is seen as only being committed by white supremacists and members of the far right or the alt-right, and black people can be racist too. We need to see white supremacy and institutional racism as problems that we all have to invest time, effort, and thought into dealing with. It is from this bias then, this thinking diagonally, that anti-racism can begin to reconstruct subjectivities, institutions, epistemologies, and discourses on the human, and also regimes of recognition. That's it, Mo. I've finished.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that brilliant intervention. Sometimes it's good to just... Oh, great, thank you. Sorry. Sometimes it's good to just take a minute to just, let things sink in. I know Shirley Anne mentioned that as well the other day in our conversations. So we did end a little bit before time, so...
Oh, I'm glad I was to time. I thought it was really long.
No. We're good. We're good.
I said to Mo earlier, don't worry if you don't have any questions. We can break early and get to the refreshments.
I'm sure there are lots. We're going to take some questions, if that's okay, and we'll just kind of do one question at a time rather than sort of accumulating a couple of questions. We'll start there with Willie.
Shirley, thank you for the talk.
Thanks, Willie.
Very simple question. Why do you prefer the term whiteliness above whiteness?
It's not necessarily a preference, because I think they perhaps mean the same thing. You know, you can use whiteness or whiteliness. I was merely using George Yancey's term because I think I like it because it also, to me, talks about whiteness as a process, as a process of being attached to white supremacy, which whiteness can sometimes be mistaken to be about skin only. So that's why I prefer it. But whiteness also serves. But I also think when you use whiteness, like, for example, I don't necessarily like to say white people. I like to say people racialized as white, because whiteness is also a category that moves across contexts and across different bodies as well. In one context, somebody might be seen as white. In another, they might not. Same person. So I think whiteliness provides more of a connection to the process of white supremacy and how it works. And it works through being attached, through suturing, through being sewn in a way, to the body of white supremacy as theory, as society, as political economy, as affective attachment. So that's why I use it. But maybe I just use it because I like George Yancey's work too. It's good.
Can I also just ask a question about, towards the end there, you mentioned a little bit that, or at least alluded to the fact that, you know, whiteness isn't, and I suppose this is the question. My understanding was that you were kind of heading towards the direction that whiteness isn't necessarily a matter only of pigmentation, but that there is a sense in which, as Fanon taught us, in which it is an attitude or particular disposition, you know, psychic or epistemic disposition.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can say a little bit about what that means for Black subjects in the process of becoming and being interrupted by the category of whiteness as an epistemic glitch.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about it in terms of epistemology then, just knowledge production? I can talk about that, for example, using me as somebody who went to the UK at the age of like 20 and then went to college to do my first degree, my bachelor's in education. So I come from Jamaica. You know, I read Frantz Fanon when I was maybe 14, latest 13, something like this. My cousin lent me that book. And I came from a context which was a post-colonial context, you know, one in which it was about becoming an independent nation, becoming a Black independent nation, and went to a context where it was only about thinking my thoughts through white-generated knowledge. Since I came from a former colony, we also had some of that there, but we also had teachers who made it distant from us. This is what you have to learn to get your O-levels, you know, your Oxford and Cambridge O-levels. I went to grammar school. So this is what you're going to learn. You're going to learn, like, the geography of the UK. It doesn't relate to you, but we're going to learn this, and you're going to get your O-levels. But there I was expected to bind myself to things that didn't have great meaning for me as a young Black woman. So then I had to try and subvert that by introducing other sorts of knowledges, but they were never acknowledged. I was always directed to go back and read Weber, you know, because that's what counted as knowledge, or some other like white theory. So I did very badly in my first year. I nearly left. But then I had some great Black teachers, two, to be precise. One was Raminder Singh and the other was Ranjit Arora. Imagine, I remember their names 40 years on, because they really encouraged me to stay and made me realize that what I should do in order to survive the institution was to develop very sophisticated critiques of what I was reading, rather than saying, nah, this doesn't mean anything to me really, you know, blah, blah. To develop sophisticated critiques, so really to use the art of argumentation against theory that I didn't think was so good. So that kind of helped me to survive. But I still had to, of course, regurgitate some of it, because you do, don't you? You have to also place yourself within the canon as such in order for critique to develop. That's just how academic life really, really is. But now, what I try and do, like many other Black scholars, is to use theory that's not necessarily out of, the white canon as such, to use the theory of black scholars and scholars of color, wherever in the world they might come from. I try to do that a lot. I try to do that in my teaching as well, because I think that's part of what I should do as somebody interested in, anti-racist transformation. But it's a real struggle for undergraduates, I believe. Well, I think. Is it still a struggle for you as undergraduates in the room? Yeah, because, we still have the same kind of canon in existence, and you're supposed to know it, right? Yeah. So that's something for us as educators to really think about. What is it that we teach our students? Do we have to really teach our students the same things that we learned in the same way? Or do we need to, infuse our work with the tools that students can use for critique? Yeah. That was a hard question, Mo. Simply put, but hard, right?
But two questions. The one is based on your research in the UK
Yes.
and data from the UK. As you were speaking about unconscious bias and then, kind of imagining the racialized white person, I was stuck by just thinking about, are we talking about, a heteronormative situation in that kind? And or is there in your research, as you're looking at issues of, intersectionality
Yes.
with gender, sexuality, ability,
Yeah.
that because people are, maybe more conscious and not as ignorant,
Yes.
you're finding that there's a mitigation of the whiteness or not.
Yes.
So that's the one question. And then in this country lately, you made a comment about blacks being racist too, or
Yes.
not. Now you may know that here we've got black Africans, brown Africans who now call themselves Khoisan roots and First Nation peoples. We've got categories of Indian who are not from India at
Yes.
all. And very recently there was quite a spat in the paper between some inside a political party, where people were saying, these so-called Indians are racist towards the black Africans. I'd like to know what your thoughts are around that in terms of shades of grey in this country. Thanks.
All right. I'll answer that. I'll answer those two, or I'll try to answer those two. I think I tend to describe myself as somebody who's involved in intersectional racism studies. So I see all categories as being racialized in a way, like ability is also a racialized category, for example, gender is too. But I think, to be honest, I think in the UK context, in universities, gender is the category that gets the most visibility, right? So, for example, I could get a job as a woman because of there's this thing called Athena Swan, the Athena Swan project, which is about getting more women into like professorships, say, of the progression of women in institutions. So I would write on my form, I am a woman, and then I'd get promotion. I'm a black woman, maybe not, but a woman in the UK context, gender is about white women still, white straight women, white middle class women or elite women, able-bodied women, so, but gender would be the category that could get you something. Race won't get you anything. Disability won't get you anything. Being queer won't get you anything either, And of course, being working class won't get you anything at all either. But thinking intersectionally certainly is something that's important to any work that you do on racism anyway. So Indian anti-black racism, right? So we have this discussion in the UK too, and we've had it for many, many decades. Certainly in the black movement, we also had this discussion. And for me, it's about thinking that we can all sew ourselves into white supremacy and white racism, which is why I like so much Charles Mills's version of the racial contract. We can all be signatories to that. If within the racial contract we're going to get something, if we sign up to it, as Indian we'd have to sign up to, black people are inferior. And it doesn't matter what their status is, they're inferior to me, because that is the nature of the racial contract that we occupy in the UK. So I would say that they can practice anti-black racism, of course, but then you have to think about where does that anti-black racism come from? Because I know we can't talk about origins, because Ian Law always says to me, don't think of origins, because it's like, it's polyracisms, that's what we need to think about. But in terms of the UK, I'm very focused on that and thinking about where does anti-black racism come from? It does have a history, it has a particular genealogy. It doesn't come out of Indian and black relations necessarily, does it? I wouldn't say. It comes out of colonialism, enslavement, and indenture. That's where it comes out of. And I know you've had a similar process of indenture and enslavement here as well, so maybe we need to think about it in those broad terms as well. Of course, we also can't think about anti-black racism without thinking about how that is inflected by class as well. So if in this context, Indians would be more middle class, I don't know, right, than blacks, they could also take on middle class attributes of seeing, black women, black men in certain ways. I don't know, which would be more to say they are again inferior in terms of class. I have no idea. But I would say that when people say to me that black people are racist to white people, I would go, well, you need to think about where racism came from and how it functions societally. And if somebody says to me Indians are racist against blacks, I would say the same thing. Did Indians from India, which is where Indian South Africans would have come from, I expect, just like Indian Jamaicans, did they develop anti-African descent racism in the subcontinent? Or was that something that they inherited in the parts of the world to which they were taken? I think that's an important question that we need to think about, because we must never underestimate the importance of colonialism and colonial connections, because they still emerge now in the 21st century as really in very familiar ways, I would say. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but that was a little attempt at it.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you, Nancy.
I think this is a question that I've had almost like an ongoing brief snippet of a discussion that I may have had with you on and off. It's just about the idea of the black academic, or the black academic, not an idea, the person navigating the university space, especially because it's a very white supremacist space.
Yes.
And I'm glad that you use the word, because people constantly try to talk you down when you acknowledge it for what it is. It's like, no one's coming in with a SWAT sticker, so what do you mean? White supremacist, like you mad, and you're supposed to be an English literature word, but you lecture, but you don't know what the word means. So like you walk around constantly being gaslit, because now you see the racism almost everywhere, and then you have to wonder, maybe I am a little mad, And then in this space, the individuals who are empowered, who are put into managerial positions, are the people who pander to whiteliness. And I think that's related to that soft reform, if I understood your soft reform correctly, that you would, is it that?
Yes.
So you'd have black individuals or individuals who identify either as black, as non-white, etc., who are put into managerial posts, and because they are, your term I think would be a lovely member of the team, no? And then the individuals who speak out against racism are labeled, no, she's just having a tantrum, or she's just, you know, she's going on an outrage again, etc. Oh, I don't want her there. What will she say around the VC or the DVC? You know?
Yes.
It's going to embarrass us. So then what happens? You know, what happens in those spaces? Why should we stay? Or why should we stay and continue to feel uncomfortable? Or why should we continue paying psychiatrists and psychologists fees? You know? Or why should we continue eating and breaking bread and coming into meetings and playing as though we are working together with individuals who clearly are not working with us? And we are not having the same purpose. So ultimately, like, where does our pretense stop? On either side of the dynamic in this university space. And then still we have the audacity to go to students in class and assume that we can teach them about living their authentic selves. You know? Meanwhile, we're walking around and everything is really cloak and dagger. You know, it's like we're playing intellectual Cluedo now. What is this one's agenda? What's being said later on? How must I navigate this? Do I really want the promotion? Would it be worth it? You know? I'd just like your response to that.
Well, I do feel those comments clearly, Nancy, and I think really it's for me it's been a bit of a journey in academic life. As you know, I'm kind of old to be a professor for the first time, but that's how it is. Because even if you play the game and you go and you break the bread and you do the smiles, you mightn't get anything. So what you've got to really think about is, do I want to get anything? What do I want to get? And do I really want to compromise myself to get this thing? You know? So I think really it's always a political choice. We don't, I shouldn't say we, I'll just say I have not had the luxury of being able to choose. I couldn't say, I will do this, and I will, you know, I couldn't have my 5-year plan like my white colleagues, right? So everyone's supposed to have a 5-year plan, and in 5 years you would have done this, this, and this, then you'd have got your promotion. No. So being in a context like that, where nothing was guaranteed, it doesn't make you reckless. What it makes you do is analyze the institution in which you work and think about yourself and what it is that you can cope with without having to pay the fees, right? The psychologist fees, and get all that intense counseling from your friends as well on the phone. So what you can cope with yourself as a person, and what it is that you want out of your professional life, but also your personal life as well. Because of course it's in your personal life that you get solace from all of the crazy stuff that you endure at work, right? All the racism that you endure. I shouldn't call it crazy stuff, it's racism. All the racism you endure. All the anti-black woman and women of color racism that you endure. So you really have to, I think, become a skillful navigator of spaces and try and find spaces that nurture you rather than spaces of negative energy which try and eat you alive. And I speak as somebody who was nearly eaten alive but came out the other side. So it's hard. And we always have to do the extra work of self-care, of course, but also of reading the institution, of reading the room, of reading people that we're in meetings with. So we're always looking for, well, I am always looking for, what's under that word, you know? What's under that little flick of the eye or something like that, you know what I mean? Because it's only that in that way that you can understand what it means for you as a professional and a person in that space, really. So, Nancy's hard work. It's a lifetime of hard work.
and then another one here. But before we do, if I can just use my privileges as the facilitator to squeeze in a question, I wanted to know about I know it's very rude. It's so rude. It's so wrong. But I'm doing it. But I'm consciously biased. But I did wonder, Shirley, just to pick up from what Nancy was saying, if you could maybe just say something about because you spoke about normative white disruption as a way of rupturing white fragility, but in the context where conviviality is kind of, the way things go, right? And the word I get a lot is collegiality. You've got to be collegial. So maybe you can say something. I don't know what the next question is, but if it fits in with it.
That old chestnut, collegiality.
So some of my best friends are people who self-construct as white.
Yes.
And in our relations, right, because I self-construct as black, in our relations, they constantly really try to help me, right, to self-construct as white, or at least not as black as I am. I seemingly am hell-bent. And one of the things that comes, I want to zoom in on, that concept you gave, the phrase subject formation.
Yes.
Right? And then I want to perhaps in some way oppose it to black self-construction.
Yes.
And end up with white fragility, right? My aim, of course, right, is to self-critique here, right? Is to be critical of the self, and perhaps also to show, right, how much of a problem that can become, right? So in our relations, as we're trying to help each other, one of the things that always becomes clear to me is how you have to disappear into systems. If you want to be white, right, and if you want to be properly white, disappear into systems so that when you are looking at yourself, you're no longer looking at an object that is distinct from yourself, right? You're simply looking at what is naturally there, right? And so when we're talking about nature, when we're talking about, what you naturally have to do, right? It's not as if you're looking at something else and you're studying it, right? You're looking at yourself and how you should naturally act in a particular situation, right? This is not the system that I inherit, right, from people like Biko, right? And their notion of black consciousness, right? Part of what they demand from me is a constant looking at the self before I step out, right? And so part of what they want from me is constantly to look at yourself and relate to others and the world as the self, right? And that is why I'm then constantly looking at myself and critiquing myself, right? And so I hesitate, I stop, I wait, I think, right? Now, faced with white fragility, that is almost always what I'm going to do, right? And so when I am with a colleague or another person who self-constructs as white and they're disappearing into systems, right? And I go for them, right, to say that, wait, let's not, this is a problem, this is oppression, this is racism, all of that, right? And they present me with white fragility. I am almost always going to hesitate. I'm going to stop, look at myself and see if they do in fact have a point. Right? I'm going to wonder if, in fact, I have inflicted pain on them. I'm going to wonder and stress about how I could do this to another person. Right? At that moment, that person has disappeared into a system, and tomorrow, it is that system then, right, that is going to organize and dictate what I should do. Yes. Right? And so I worry. I worry, right? As I said, I'm trying to self-critique here. I'm wondering if, in fact, I should not be more active in becoming white. Because it seems to me that things are not going to change if I continue being me and self-constructing as a black subject. Because I am actively constructing myself to hesitate, to wait, to be a person.
My goodness, brother, that was powerful, beautiful, beautiful, amazing. Well, no, I don't think you should construct yourself as a white person because, simply put, you can never be one. Just be you. Be the person who critiques. Be the person who can express in that way. Be the person who can see the system for what it is, as something that tries to mold us as black people into what we are not. And of course, never lose who you are. Never lose your emotional connectedness to people who have been racist towards you. To always self-question is a good thing. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with pausing for a moment before you act. I mean, many people will say to you that know me, you know, you send Shirley an email, and it's an email that's not such a nice email. I won't fire one off immediately like that. No, I have to make myself calm down from the hurt I feel. Look at that email, look at every word in it, including the punctuation marks. And next day, I get back to you with an email that I've thought about and think, you know, that it will suffice. Because I don't think that necessarily I'm someone who likes to hurt people either. That's never my goal. I don't see that as my role to hurt people. And I don't think necessarily that responding to hurt with hurt is always the right thing to do, but sometimes you can't help it. It just comes out. And nothing is wrong with that either, but thank you for your intervention. That was wonderful. You should write it down so we can all read it. Oh, it's been recorded. Has it been recorded? We can all listen to it again. That's fantastic. That was better than my paper. It was excellent. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Brightness. I said forgiveness because I was thinking of something else. Thank you, Brightness. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. I'm actually shaking where I'm sitting.
Oh.
And I can actually relate to what my colleague was sharing with all of us, and also what he just shared with us. And I'm taken aback to your title. In fact, when you talk about unconscious and conscious. And I find us in a space where there are two sides. There are those who are conscious, and there are those who are unconscious. And the unconscious ones in South Africa have picked up in the context of the whiteliness, and the conscious one as the black people. So you are in the constant space of being reminded that you are black. You are in a constant space where you are reminded that you don't belong here. And quite frankly, you decide to be an advocate, to fight and to ensure that you contribute in being the change that you want to see.
Yes.
But you find that you find yourself in what I would call multiple jeopardy. You become a multiple victim in the process. Quite interestingly, as I looked into this, it touched on some of my findings on my PhD, where I've actually looked on workplace bullying in higher education, and I interviewed women in 3 institutions. And some of the things that I've picked up, in fact, my conclusion, I just said to my professor, you know, Prof, what I can conclude is that workplace bullying, it's modern racism, period. Because what I was picking up, the issues of invisibility, visibility are there. And it goes back to the point of being conscious and being unconscious about the things that are happening in the system. But there is also an element of silencing, which is systematic. Silencing using policies. When you talk about racism, they tell you, but Brightness, we have a policy on racism.
Yes.
But if you look into that policy and you dip into that policy, it actually talks about if you say people are racist, you have a responsibility to prove. And if you can't prove, you can actually be charged for saying people are racist. So automatically that policy is silencing you because you find yourself, if I speak up and I find guilty, then I will have a case.
Yes.
And it's a serious issue in South Africa. You can exit the system because of that.
Yes.
But what is even said is that as black people, we find ourselves in what I call self-silencing. You choose now to be silent because it's the only way that you can survive in the system. It's the only way that you can be promoted in the system. There are committees within the institution. We sometimes say committees are your senate. There are committees, the research committees, and how they are operationalized. You find a student proposal, petty things, and then they say, no, we can't accept this proposal. You look at other white colleagues, and you can see that, you know what, this proposal is not up to scratch. The whole process is to frustrate you as a colleague, as an academic. So how do we find ourselves saying, why do I have to remain in this institution? Quite frankly, from where I'm sitting, I'm tired.
Yes.
I am tired.
Yes.
And I'm asking myself, is it worth my health to continue like this? You find yourself, some of the things that I've picked up on my research, which was quite sad for me. If you look at black academics, when they narrated their stories, the story doesn't just begin when they become academics. They tell their stories when they were students in the university. And some of them, they're saying, the reason I am here as a black academic, it's because I don't want the black student to experience that what I have experienced.
Yeah.
So my question is, where to from here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. I was very comfortable and uncomfortable listening to your presentation. I had a lot of feelings as well, listening to the two colleagues. And I think, you focused on unconscious bias and how white people play this notion. But I think that there's a response from black people. Maybe it's conscious, maybe it's unconscious hurt, maybe it's conscious, maybe it's unconscious anger, but there are feelings, there are experiences. And I think everybody sitting in this room has a set of recollections, kind of post-traumatic stress going through their minds. When you live in a multi-wounded society, I don't think that there are many people in this room that are not running through multiple experiences at breakneck speed as you're talking. But I was left with a question of, we have this discussion and we express what we're expressing, which is important. Although I would have been nice if we could have had more time. I had the sense that almost many people have things to express, so maybe more discussions. But I was left with a question of, what does this mean for us now? I mean, what I'm hearing and what I'm feeling, this is the 5th time this week that a black woman has told me, I'm tired. This is a feeling, well, in academia, this is a feeling that is, it's not a single person saying this. And what do we as an institution do? Because ultimately it's about power structures as well, it's about publishing, it's about the way that journals are run.
Yes.
We have to publish in what is called SAPSI accredited journals. And most SAPSI accredited journals are so white, male dominated. It's about an entire infrastructure that you kind of battle against, and so much harder than somebody else perhaps. Thank you, Ma.
Yeah. I can't answer any of those questions. Why? Because I am in exactly the same position as you, actually, but in a different academic context. I recognize everything that you said, Brightness, from those women. I also recognize your tiredness, because I was saying to Encarna today, I feel tired. Maybe it's because I've had a hard year, but my years seem to get harder. But maybe it's an age thing too, because I'm quite old. But I think it's because, things accumulate, don't they? They accumulate. So it's just accumulations of years as well, of dealing with what you described quite aptly, I think, as post-traumatic stress, which goes unrecognized and unattended to, but which has massive impact on black women academics that I've spoken to in the UK as well. So people talk about, I've said this in another paper, people talk about the somatization of racism, So women have said to me, I'm sure that my migraines come from that. I'm sure my intense backache comes from that. I'm sure that, you know, moments in which I feel unable to go outside come from that. You know, that's not a way to live a life, is it really, when you think about it? And I mean, one of the things that always strikes me is that our institutions never think about necessarily the well-being of their staff. And we are the university. Without us, the university would not function. You know, and by well-being, I mean every sort of aspect of us as holistic beings, really, not just physical, but, you know, our psyches too need attention. But we're left to go deal with that ourselves, because if we don't deal with that ourselves, then it's like, oh, you know, that Shirley has a really bad anxiety problem. I don't know how long she's going to last in this department. You know what I mean? So you get this badge put on you. Oh, she's got a mental health issue. So it's really tough, right, Bernice? It's tough. And it's about, why do we stay? And I think for me, you said one of the reasons why I stay. Well, I stay because I get paid, of course. You know, that's important. Maybe not paid enough, but that's beside. I get paid. It's a job, right? But I also stay because I think that as an educator, I still feel it's one of the places that I can do something, right? I can make small changes to the mindsets of all of my students. I can change how people see the world through my writing, maybe. I can change how people think through doing talks, maybe. So I stay for that reason. Yeah, I stay because I feel that I'm an educator. And I also feel that being a stubborn Jamaican who's also an Aries, I'm not going to let anybody move me from where I am. I'll go when I'm good and ready. I'm not good and ready yet, very soon though. Yeah, so it's been a great joy for me to have graduated in my life. A lot of black women and men MAs and PhDs as well, and white students who are also anti-racist in their perspective and in their thoughts. So that's been good. I think I've made a contribution in that way to the wider discipline of sociology. So I'm happy with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the brilliant talk. Thanks for the questions and the comments. And we can pick up the conversation over some drinks. Yeah, unconscious bias as an alibi for white supremacy. Please help me thank Professor Shirley Anne Tate.